These people were not supposed to exist under the law, and yet their blood now runs through hundreds of thousands of Americans. Trace their family lines backward, generation by generation, and the branches begin to converge. They narrow. They lead to a handful of families in one remote corner of colonial Virginia. Their neighbors gave them a name like a mark of shame: Melungeons. 40 surnames, a closed loop. Collins marries Gibson. Their daughter marries Mullins. His son takes another Collins. For 200 years straight. By the laws of genetics, a family line like that had only one possible outcome. Hidden disease would pile up and the line would fade out within a few generations. This one survived for 200 years and grew larger. And when one of its descendants, a man who spent 40 years reconstructing these families in the archives, took a DNA test around the year 2000, the results stunned him. It matched none of the family stories. The blood erased everything these Melungeons had said about themselves for 200 years. And here is what they had said. Portuguese sailors, Turkish captives, Mediterranean blood brought into these mountains centuries ago. A beautiful story, the same one you have probably heard before. But DNA left nothing of it standing. How did a family line that was supposed to die out instead survive and multiply? What did 200 years of marriages within 40 families do to their bodies and their blood? Why does their own DNA contradict the legend they told the world for centuries? And what was that legend hiding? And here is the question you cannot ignore. If your family has the surname Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, or Bunch, and if your test one day returned a percentage you could not explain, you may have just seen their blood running through your own veins. To understand why this blood was never supposed to reach us, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, to the man who thought he knew who he was. His name was Jack Goins. In his family, a beautiful old story had been passed down. We are Portuguese. And in the 1880 census, distant relatives of the Goins family were indeed listed that way, as Portuguese. But even within the same family, the stories did not line up. His own grandfather, Harrison, wrote Indian in the race category on his World War I draft card and called himself one-quarter Indian, while his grandfather's sister told a story about Portuguese ancestors. One family, and immediately two convenient legends to fit the past into. Goins spent 40 years in the archives, pulling church records and court cases, building the Melungeon family tree from paper. Then, in the early 2000s, he submitted his own DNA. The results showed African ancestry along the direct male line, something no one in the family had ever named, neither the supporters of the Portuguese story nor the supporters of the Indian one. The man who knew his family history better than anyone learned that both of its favorite versions were inventions. And he was not alone. In 2012, a study came out that changed everything. The team, Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Crane, published an analysis in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, a scientific journal devoted to genetic genealogy, examining the DNA of core Melungeon families. They looked at two things: the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, unchanged through the male line for countless generations, and mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, unchanged through the female line in the same way. The pattern was brutally clear. The male lines were half European and half sub-Saharan African. Key families, including the Goins line itself, carried haplogroup E1b1a, a genetic marker that originated in West Africa. And the female lines were almost entirely European, dominated by haplogroup H, one of the most common in Europe. Put that together, and any story about Portuguese sailors falls apart. African fathers, European mothers. What happened here happened close to home, in colonial America, and had been hidden for centuries beneath stories about distant seas. The only question is where and when two such people could have met and had free children. Because in the America we remember, that was impossible. The answer is hidden in a short stretch of time that schoolbooks barely mention. Picture Virginia in the mid-1640s. The machinery of slavery had not yet been fully assembled. The line between African and European had not yet hardened into a wall. Africans arrived here not only as slaves, some came as indentured servants under contract. Work off the term, become free, get land, hire others yourself. And in that gap, on tobacco farms and in frontier settlements, free African men and European women formed families. Their children were born free. Under colonial law at the time, a child's status followed the mother, and these mothers were free women. These children carried English surnames, owned land, and in some places even voted. They were, for all appearances, the root of the families that would one day be called Melungeons. Then the window began to close. By the early 1700s, the colonies were tightening racial laws one by one. Free people of mixed ancestry were stripped of the right to vote, to own weapons, to testify in court, and to marry white people. The world they had been born free into was reorganizing around them, and the very category of free person of color was becoming dangerous. So they did the only thing left to them. They began to move. From coastal Virginia to North Carolina, where tax records listed them as free mulattoes, then farther west into the valleys and foothills, and finally into the mountains of what would become Tennessee. With each move, they married into white neighbor families, took Scotch-Irish surnames, and with each generation their skin grew lighter. In the 1790 census, some of the same families that had been listed as mulatto for decades were suddenly recorded as white. The mountains gave them what the lowlands no longer could: distance. A thin strip of rocky land on the ridges that no one wanted badly enough to seize. Neighbors who did not look too closely. But that refuge also set in motion the process that should have destroyed them. Because when a few families are sealed off in a mountain hollow and marry only each other for 200 years, something irreversible begins to happen to their blood. That is the paradox in the headline. And to understand it, you do not need a genetics degree, only one simple image. Imagine a big city, thousands of people, thousands of different families. Every person carries rare defects hidden in their genes. Almost all of us do. We just do not know it because they are recessive. A recessive defect is one that stays silent until a child receives it from both sides, from father and mother alike. In a big city, the chance that two carriers of the same rare defect will meet and have a child is tiny. The defects are diluted into the larger sea of blood. Now remove the city. Leave 40 families on one ridge. Scientists call this the founder effect, when an entire future population grows from a tiny handful of ancestors. And that handful carries its own random deck of rare defects. The tighter the marriage circle, the more often the same defect comes to a child from both sides. What would sink without a trace in a city rises and accumulates in a closed loop, and that loop had a face. On Newman's Ridge, a narrow ridge in the Tennessee mountains, lived Mahala Mullins, known to her own people as Big Haley. She was a moonshiner known across the region. Lawmen knew where she lived, but again and again they could not drag her down from the mountain. She could not fit through the door, and the path was too steep. They said of her, "You can catch her, but you can't carry her out." But the real point is not the moonshine. It is her surname. Mullins, one of that small cluster. Open the Newman's Ridge church books over the span of 100 years, and the same surnames appear page after page. Collins marries Gibson. Their daughter marries Mullins. His son takes another Collins. The same handful of names in a circle, generation after generation. Mahala and hundreds like her are that closed loop made visible. Real people on a real ridge, where the choice was between marrying their own and facing violence or the courts from the outside. The same rule is easy to see in other peoples as well. Among the Amish, a religious community that married only within itself for centuries, Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, a condition marked by extra fingers and short stature, appears at rates many times higher than in the general population. Among Ashkenazi Jews, the same pattern of closed marriages led to the buildup of Tay-Sachs disease over generations. One mechanism, different peoples, A small founding group plus marriages within that group produces a concentration of rare diseases. And here is the stakes of it. In those 40 mountain families, that mechanism should have worked at full strength. Defects should have piled up, child mortality should have risen, and the line should have slowly gone out. By every calculation, this family tree should have narrowed and ended sometime in the 19th century. Instead, it grew to hundreds of thousands. Something was keeping it alive. And to understand that, we have to look at the diseases the Melungeons really did have, because a legend grew up around them, and that legend needs to be taken apart. In 1988, a man named Brent Kennedy became seriously ill. The diagnosis baffled the doctor. Familial Mediterranean fever, a hereditary disease found almost exclusively among peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, Turks, Armenians, Arabs, Sephardic Jews. Where did it come from in a man who, according to his own account, had Scotch-Irish roots in Virginia? Kennedy began digging into his family and traced it back to the Melungeons. From that disease and that personal shock came his 1994 book, which made a national splash and zakrepił a beautiful version of the story. Melungeons were descendants of Turks, Moors, Mediterranean wanderers. Thousands of people were delighted to see themselves as the heirs of these exotic ancestors. The problem is that science did not confirm that story. There has been no direct study showing familial Mediterranean fever in the Melungeons as a group. Kennedy's illness remained his personal mystery, not proof of Turkish roots. And the famous Anatolian bump, a bump on the back of the head that was counted as a special Mediterranean trait, is just the occipital protuberance found in people all over the world. Extra fingers and the rest of the supposed Melungeon traits are folklore, not a genetic passport. But here is what matters, and this is where the legend turns against itself. Diseases really did accumulate in those closed mountain families, just by the mechanism from the previous chapter, not because their ancestors had sailed in from Anatolia. Founder effect plus in-group marriage produces a spike in rare diseases in any such community. Among the Amish, among Ashkenazi Jews, among Afrikaners, among the Melungeons. The diseases were real, but the exotic explanation was empty. And so the main question changes. If the blood was supposed to die out and the legend of saving Turks turned out to be fiction, what actually kept this people from disappearing? What kept them alive was not blood at all, but a lie. The Portuguese story we have long treated as just a myth. Put yourself in their place. You live in Tennessee, and in 1934, the state's new constitution declares that only free whites can vote, own land, and testify in court. If you are recorded as colored, you cannot even defend your own farm in court. A neighbor claims the land is his, and you have nothing to answer with, because your word carries no weight there. Now look at what the word Portuguese meant. Under the law at the time, Portuguese people were considered white, European, Catholic, and yet allowed to be dark-skinned after centuries of Moorish contact. For a dark-skinned family desperately trying to hold on to land and to a school for their children, "We are Portuguese" was the only phrase that explained their faces and preserved their rights. To claim Indian identity after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was to risk deportation. To admit African blood was to lose everything. But Portuguese meant survival. So that is what they did. They changed what they called themselves depending on what was safest that year and in that county. One census, free person of color. The next, mulatto. 10 years later, in a new county, white. Behind it all was a hard calculation for survival, repeated thousands of times, generation after generation. In the 20th century, the state came after them in earnest. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act. Even a drop of non-white blood made you colored. A man named Walter Plecker turned his office into a hunt. He kept lists of suspicious surnames and sent them out across the counties. Families who had lived as white for several generations were reclassified overnight. Some fled to Ohio and Indiana, changed their names, and never spoke of the past again. Photographs were burned, family trees destroyed. A people who had survived 200 years in the mountains were nearly erased in one generation. But genes do not burn with photographs. In the end, they were the ones who spoke, through the very DNA tests that began this story. That is how the paradox is resolved. A family line that, by every law of genetics, should have died out, survived against itself, through movement, name changes, and a legend that even their own grandchildren eventually believed. And this story is not only about the Melungeons. Scattered across the eastern United States are other communities like them. The Lumbee in North Carolina, the Red Bones in Louisiana and Texas, the Brass Ankles in South Carolina. Everywhere the same pattern appears. People of mixed blood, born in a brief window of freedom, pushed into corners by racial laws, and hidden under another name for centuries. Today, the real history is far stronger than any tale of Turkish captives. Free Africans and European women in early Virginia formed families during that brief moment when it was still possible. When the window closed, their children moved into the mountains. When that became dangerous too, they renamed themselves and held on to the Portuguese story until it became the only truth the family remembered. That is why it all began with Jack Goins' test. He was looking for proof of a family legend, and instead found an African ancestor his relatives had hidden, even from themselves, for 200 years. And now, go back to those surnames: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Bunch. If even one of them appears in your family somewhere in Appalachia, check the old censuses. Find the ancestor who was listed as colored in one decade and suddenly white in the next. Behind every such change stands a living person, your great-great-grandfather, making a real-time decision about how to survive. This family line was not supposed to exist. It does. And maybe, right now, it lives in you.